Welcome, everybody, to another episode of RockerMike and Rob Presents. And this episode is sponsored by Park Dental Care, 12419 101st Avenue in Richmond Hill, Queens. Their number is 718-847-3800. And their website is 718dentist.com. And they take all insurances and they don't hurt. Check them out. Okay, we got a very special guest today, and I'm really excited to have her on. Her name is Bettye Kronstad, and she wrote a book about 6 years ago, came out in 2016, called Perfect Day, an intimate portrait of life with Lou Reed. Bettye, you were Lou Reed's first wife, and I'm really happy to have you here. We've been trying to get this interview for a while going. I'm glad you're here.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me.
Sure. Also, I got to mention, this book is available on Jawbone Press, and you can get it basically wherever books are sold. Amazon has it,
Right.
and some other places. And you're also you've completed a screenplay for this book, right?
Yes, I have.
Wow. Sounded like a lot of work.
Well, it's the first screenplay I wrote, so I had a lot of learning to do, but yeah.
Wow. Okay, now what compelled you to write this book?
Well, after Lou died, that would be October 27 in 2013.
Right.
There were authors that were writing books about Lou, and they started calling me up and setting up appointments to come and speak to me because of my relationship with Lou. And I gave about three of these interviews, and then it suddenly occurred to me, wait a minute, you can write, you actually teach writing. And this is a story that no one has ever heard. Why don't you write the book? Because frankly, anything I had ever read about myself, I hadn't read one thing that was accurate.
Yeah, I could totally agree with that. Everybody knows I'm a big Lou Reed fan. I've mentioned it many times on the podcast. But I've read quite a few books, and your period with Lou from 68 to 73 is very interesting and kind of like it's under documented, underreported, and maybe not always reported correctly. So when I read your book, it really opened my eyes because it kind of showed Lou in a different way, way different light than you've seen in other books. And I'm just glad you wrote it because your opinion is as important as anybody, and you were with him during that time. So for a book to finally come out that documents this from somebody so close to him, I feel is important to the whole Lou Reed story, which I think is the Lou Reed story itself can be I don't want to say wrong, but there can be a lot of wrong, not factual kind of stuff thrown in there. You agree? I guess yes. I'm saying wrong.
Yeah, there was a lot.
Yeah. Now, you met Lou in 1968.
Right.
And you were a student at Columbia at the time, right?
Right.
Okay. Tell us about the first time you met him, because it's a funny story.
Well, I was going to Mount Sinai to visit a mutual friend of ours, actually, although I didn't know at the time that he was a mutual friend, but Lincoln Suedas was Lou's roommate when he was at Syracuse University.
Right.
And I knew Lincoln through theater contacts. And so I would visit Lincoln. And one day I was waiting at the elevator, to go up to the ward to visit Lincoln. And this guy came up and and he said, "Hey, you." And I was hoping that he wasn't speaking to me, but I looked in that direction, and indeed he was.
Right.
And he said, "What are you doing here? You look normal." Lovely. So lovely. So I looked at him square in the eye and I said, "I am." Then the elevator doors opened, a group of people left the elevator and I started walking in, and he waited until I passed him, and the son of a gun slapped me on my bottom. who does something
Who
like
does
that? Yeah.
that? Even back then, that was like, what? What are you doing?
Like maybe in the Frank Sinatra days in Las
Yeah,
Vegas, in the
yeah,
50s,
yeah.
but what? So uh, I was not happy about that.
Sure.
So I did everything I could to completely ignore him.
Eh,
And he wanted to talk to me, so he was holding the elevator doors open,
Oh,
and he just kept saying, well, he started telling me who he was and that he was who I was visiting, and I said Lincoln Suedos, and he said, "Oh, Lincoln was my roommate at school. Yes, I know. That's why I'm visiting him." And and then I just tried to. Hopefully, the elevator would move soon, but he was holding the doors, and they were like now slamming up against him, and
making a noise, right?
yeah, yeah. So he finally said, well, ask him about me. Okay, just ask him who I am. And I was just really obnoxious. So finally he let me go, and I went up and had some time with Lincoln and told him my experience. And he said, "Oh, Lou, I said he was just so incredibly obnoxious." And I told him what he'd done. And he said, "Oh, he's just trying to impress you."
What a way to do
Actually,
it.
yeah,
Yeah.
that actually isn't really going to work. But
No.
yeah. But anyway, later on, apparently Lou came up after I left, or I don't remember. It's like over 50 years ago, really. And I think when I saw him coming, I left.
Oh, you took off.
I did. I took off. And then Lincoln called me about a week later and said, Lou wants to take you out. And I said, "You're kidding. Really? Probably not." But, Lincoln was persistent. So eventually that meeting was finally set up. And he actually wanted first to know if he could call me. He asked
Right.
Lincoln to ask me if he could call me. So finally, just to stop everyone from bothering me about this, I said, "Okay, okay, I will, I will, I will." And he called and we started to talk, and he actually was really kind of sweet.
Right. You saw a different side right there.
Yeah, he was sweet and
Yeah. Yeah.
shy. But I was basically on my way. I was leaving for Europe in a couple of weeks by the time he contacted me. And he said, "Well, can I take you out?" And I said, "Well, I'm leaving the country
Wow.
in a couple of days." And he said, "Well, can I see you before you leave, the night before you leave?" And I thought, what? As if this would be a person that I would spend the very last night in
Mm.
this country before I left it for several months, and I said, "No, I'm not going to do that." So I didn't.
Right. Right.
And then I went to Europe, and I was gone for 5 months, and I was with my friends from Colombia. Kids used to backpack through Europe at that time. It was
Yes.
safe, and that was a great way to see the country, all the different countries, and get to learn to know the people and the culture rather than going on, tours and where you don't see actually anything of the
Right. Right.
countries at all. Yeah.
Did you get like a U-Rail pass kind of thing and go
Yeah.
around? Yeah.
Yeah.
My
Yeah.
brother did that about 15 years ago.
Yeah. It was sort
Yeah.
of like a rite of passage for anybody that was in college at the time.
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of people did that.
And it was 68. So at Columbia, the school had closed down, had shut down because of the
The war,
riots.
the war protests and everything,
The
right?
riots. It had, student protests about Vietnam had shut the university down. So we actually got to leave a month earlier. So I had another month.
Right, right, right. Now, when you met Lou, well, I guess I should say when Lincoln talked to you about him, I guess he explained to you who he was. He was in the Velvet Underground, a musician, all that.
And I had actually heard, his music because I loved rock and roll.
Right.
And so I knew once I found out who he was, I actually had heard, the Velvet Underground music, some
Well,
of it.
anybody at that time, 68 in New York City, you at least had some knowledge of who they were, even if you didn't know the music.
Yeah, you did.
Yeah, yeah. And I
I
mean,
was actually more into Motown, frankly.
really?
Yeah, I love
Okay.
Motown and the British invasion, but
Right.
the Velvet Underground were very good, so we all knew them.
Right. Now,
And that actually got me interested because I knew that he was a very good writer. And since I was an English major, that was interesting to me.
that was something you guys had in common that you could talk
Yeah.
about, right?
Yeah.
Okay. But you came at a time when the Velvets were pretty much going to break up soon, right?
Yes.
And, did Lou kind of talk to you about that? Did he explain that the band was breaking up, or he was thinking of leaving, or what did he tell you about the band?
Well, an interesting thing was I was in Paris at the time, and I was traveling with my friends, and they were European, so they were working, and I would stay home and then meet them up afterwards. And I was sitting in Paris having my roll and a bowl of coffee in a
Mhm.
cafe and reading the Herald Tribune, and suddenly there was this article about the Velvet Underground and Lou Reed and how he was bringing all these literary devices into rock and roll music, and that was
I,
extremely interesting to me. So when I came home, again, I spoke to Lincoln, and Lincoln told him that I was back, so he immediately called, and I agreed to meet him.
okay.
And so the first time I met him was at this famous bar uptown near Columbia, and we went a restaurant, and we went in, and I met him there, and he was very gallant, when he like bowed and kissed my hand and stuff.
Right.
This is
Wow.
quite
To-
different from
Total
slapping.
gentleman. Total
Yeah,
gentleman. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, quite different from slapping me on my bottom.
I
So I
think
think
so.
I think he heard that that was probably not the way to go.
Yeah.
And anyway, he drank, and I didn't. I just had a glass of Chablis at the time, and I was
Hmm.
just having a glass of wine. He was talking, and they were recording. I think, their last album, and he kept drinking, and then he started complaining and kvetching about Cale, and like nobody ever listens to him,
Hmm.
and so he actually started raving, and I think Cale had been gone by this time.
Right. I was going to mention that he'd
Yeah,
gone already, so he was
yeah,
still kind
but
of.
he was still raving about Cale,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
now Doug Yule was in the
Yeah.
band, and he was complaining about Doug, and he didn't like, what had bothered him about John Cale was that he just thought it was too artsy fartsy. He wanted to get back to rock and roll,
Yeah.
and Cale was a classically trained musician.
Right. A lot more avant-garde maybe than
Yeah,
we wanted to
yeah.
be. Yeah.
So, Lewis was concerned because he felt that, they should have gotten a lot bigger than they were, but they just weren't making any money, and he wasn't. They weren't getting any bigger, and he'd been trying to make a go with this band for years, and so he'd kicked Cale out,
Yeah.
and Doug came on, and they were now recording. What was the first
Loaded.
album? Yeah, it
Loaded.
was Loaded. Yeah, and that was when Sweet Jane was on. And when
Right.
I heard Sweet Jane, it was like, oh my God, this guy it was just wonderful. But w- during the day, he was drinking a lot.
Right.
He
Right.
was raving, and so then all of the people were were looking at us, and he was creating a scene, which I never really particularly enjoyed. So
Hmm.
I got him out of there.
Yeah.
He could barely walk, but he insisted upon walking me home, which was about 10 blocks. And so I steered him in the right direction, and we got going, and we got to my house. It goes on 116th Street in Riverside Drive. We walked down the hill,
Right.
and he got to the front door, and he looked at me, and I just said, no, I don't bring boys up to the room.
Right.
It's not gonna happen.
Yeah.
So he said, okay, and he started walking back up he kissed me on my forehead, actually, and then walked away, and I could see I didn't know how he was gonna make it, because he was falling down drunk.
Yeah. He was that wrecked. Wow.
Yeah. So I was afraid, I called after him, and I said, "Hey, I'm out of cigarettes. Why don't I just walk up with you? Because there was a cigarette stand on 116th Street at the subway. And
Right.
I figured that way I could escort him up the hill.
Yeah.
And so that's what happened. And he's actually was very funny. He's a very funny guy.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's very charming, but he was sometimes difficult to understand. But
Sure.
at any rate, I got him to the top of the staircase and he held on to the rail and went down and into the bowels of the subway, and he was gone, but he called about the next day. Yeah, actually.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, fast forward a little bit. You guys, your relationship got more serious. The Velvet Underground ended. Well, Lou left, I should say, because the Velvet Underground actually did go on a little bit longer, but Lou left the band, and
Well, he actually called me, to come and see him at Max's
yeah,
for the last. He said it was going to be their last show, and I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, we're breaking up, and I don't want you to tell anybody." So I actually was there. I did come down, and it was a wonderful show.
Wow.
And then he did indeed leave that night and went off to the Long Island to live with his parents.
right, right, and this period of Lou, even though it's a kind of a short period, but it's kind of important because it's a lost period where not much is really talked about. There was a point in that period, really, I guess about a 6 or 8 month period, where he really was thinking of giving up music altogether and becoming getting into a literary career, writing poetry and stories and things like that. And you were right in the middle of that. What's your opinion of this period?
Well, he was a really, really sweet man.
Right.
And I was quite enamored by him once I got to know him. And it ended up that, every weekend we would either spend it at my apartment in New York, in the city, near Columbia, or the next weekend I would go out and spend the weekend at his house with his parents. And so that was pretty much our major courting period. And it was really great because it was very quiet. He wasn't crazy. He wasn't drinking nearly as much as he was before. He was seeing a therapist and he was writing. He was, because he always he wanted to be a poet. Actually, was he gonna stay in rock and roll and write that way, or could he actually make it in as a poet? So he began writing, and he would share his work with me, and he was sending it out, and he was getting published, and he actually got published in the Harvard Advocate. He was wonderful. He was a really wonderful writer.
Right.
And I was hoping that's where his career would go.
That's where you felt his strengths lied more than playing music, really just with literary.
Well, he was an English major himself,
That's true. Yeah.
at Syracuse. And yes, he was just wonderful. And I was, and it's a much quieter life
Right.
as a poet than certainly in rock and roll. And there's not all those horrible drugs and
Well, yeah. I mean, it's interesting to kind of think about what his career could have been had he gone that direction, or even a little more seriously in that direction. He could have had both.
yeah,
You know?
kind of did in a way. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, he did from people that understood him. And I'm just going to say from my experience as a fan, it was always about the lyrics.
Yep.
It was always the words, the way he put the words together. I'm not an English lit major, but I understood that there was some kind of something different in the way that he wrote compared to the way other people were writing. He brought a certain level of street stories and things like that to music, but it wasn't just the topics. It was the way he put the words together that I was always blown away by. So I mean, he really did have both in a sense. um this all kind of peaks, this period, around March 10th of 1971. at the poetry reading that was at St. Mark's Church on 2nd Avenue in the East Village. This is where they do readings, I think about once a year, or maybe more than that then, I'm not sure. But there was a poetry reading. Now, you attended this, right?
Yep.
Okay. And how did it go?
Well, he was very nervous. We met and before the reading, and I said, because by now I had left Columbia and had transferred to the Neighborhood Playhouse School of the theater. Lincoln had actually helped me, said that I should go into theater, and helped me, coached and directed my audition. And I had been accepted at the Playhouse with Sanford Meisner. So I now was in theater training, which was really intense.
Right.
But I said to him, do you want to go over the poems? We could just practice. You could just say them to me. So we did that for a while, and he was great. So then we got in the subway and went down to St. Mark's Place, and we walked in, and there were all these literary figures there, Jim Carroll, who was a sweetheart, and I
Right.
guess Patti Smith, and Allen Ginsberg was there, and
Some Warhol people were there too, right? To show a little
yeah,
support, I guess, right?
yeah. And they were all very pleased to see him because he was returning, there, because everybody loved Lou. And I think a lot of what they loved about him is that he represented the wild part of them that they never actually expressed. So he pretty much expressed everybody else's craziness.
He embodied it in a way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but here he was being presented, as a poet, not a crazy person. Not a drug person or a drunk person, or in that kind of milieu. He was just, he was up there reading the work that he had been writing. And I don't know what happened, but the audience really wasn't all that terribly receptive.
Right.
And it wasn't until the poem that he wrote was called Andy's Chest, and that was about Andy Warhol when he was shot by that insane person.
Right.
And that was the only poem where he, got any kind of applause or reaction. And I could see how hurt he was. His voice was, he was a little uncertain,
Yeah.
but he actually started becoming defiant because nobody was really responding, and that's pretty much what Lou's like.
Right.
And so he finished off and came back and sat down, and well, it was very different when we left. A lot of people were not crowding around him anymore, and he left on our own.
Okay. Okay. And just so people have a little context, the poem that Bettye is talking about is Andy's Chest. Originally, it was called Andy Warhol's Chest, but Andy's Chest is the song that ends up on Transformer, and basically it was almost the same lyrics, some minor changes in there, but it's about Andy being shot, like you said, when he was shot by Valerie Solanas, is her name, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he would show people the scars on him, and Lou was very, Andy was somebody that he loved and had so much respect for, and really.
Well, not actually at that point. He was really,
Yeah.
he was furious with Warhol. Actually, I
Okay.
did my very best to keep them apart.
Oh. Okay.
Because he didn't think that Andy didn't really do anything or throw any money or do any. He wasn't
Yeah.
really producing them. So he didn't. He basically Warhol's position was, you have my name. I introduce you to the world. You're my band, and that's basically what I do.
True.
And he didn't throw any money at him, and he didn't do any PR. He wasn't setting up any tours, and Lewis pretty much blamed him for why they weren't as successful as he believed they should be. So at
Yeah.
that point, he was really very hostile to Andy. To
Right.
Andy.
Right. The reason I said what I said about him respecting him is
Oh no,
when
yeah,
you I was able to hear like the introduction to this. The New York Public Library has all this stuff, and I saw something online, and there was a recording of that night or that day, March 10th, and the intro to Andy's Chest, he just says how, he cared about him and everything like that. So that's why I say that. But I'm sure there was a lot of mixed feelings. I mean, I've seen interviews with Lou where, he very would kind of, as a wise ass, say, people thought Andy Warhol was in the band, or people thought Andy Warhol produced the record. He really didn't do anything. Like you said, he just lent his name to it.
Well, he was aware of the power of Warhol's name, so he always, had some accolades, and he was very positive and, in public about Andy Warhol, and always credit him for it because, he could basically stay on his coattails.
Right. Okay, so we're going to take a short commercial break right here. We're going to come back in a minute, and we're going to talk more about Lou. We've got Bettye Kronstad here, Lou Reed's first wife, and we'll be back in 1 minute. Hey, welcome back to RockerMike and Rob Presents, to talk more about Lou Reed with his first wife, Bettye Kronstad. Bettye wrote a fantastic book called Perfect Day, an intimate portrait of life with Lou Reed. It came out in 2016 on Jawbone Press, and you can get it anywhere that's selling books, like Amazon.
It actually was published the day that Donald Trump won the election.
Wow. Okay.
November 8th. Yeah.
Wow.
So there wasn't a whole lot of publicity at that point, because
No,
Donald basically,
the world was totally turned upside down at that point.
yeah, Trump he just vacuumed everything,
Yeah.
just sucked all the attention out of everything.
Yep. So we were talking about Lou Reed's period of time here where he was thinking about becoming a poet. And he had done a poetry reading on March 10th of 71 that didn't quite go the way he wanted. So basically, he decided to go back to music. Bettye, what was he thinking? Was he thinking, I can't be a poet or a writer? I have to play music for people to understand me. What was he thinking?
Well, a lot of this I go into in the book, and it's also and I can go into it a little bit more in depth in the screenplay
Right.
that we just finished writing. I have a partner that helped me. And what was the question again?
Well, I'm just I'm just asking.
Sorry. Oh, no, I remember. Right. So it was about 2 weeks after, and I was back out out with him and his family, and he turned to me and he said, I made a decision, and about what, and he just looked at me and said, they're never going to let me do it.
Yeah.
And I do what? They're never going to let me play rock and roll, or they're never going to let me be a poet. The only way I'm going to be able to write is rock and roll. And I said, well, okay, and of course I was very disappointed, but it was basically as a result of the response that he had gotten at St. Mark's that completely convinced him that he was never going to be able to make it as a poet. And if he was ever going to get out of his parents' house, because he was actually 30 at this point, and he said, I can't have my parents supporting me, I have to make my own life. So this is the way I can write. So I'm just going to continue doing that way.
And he could have some kind of income, obviously.
Yeah. And he had actually, he did get some royalties back. He had spent that time registering all of the Velvet Underground music to him. So
Copyright.
he got all those copyrights. So there were some royalties, and we started talking about him getting back in as a solo,
Right.
artist, as an artist on his own. So inroads had began, and there was a couple of managers that were interested. There was a producer that was interested in him. So he started to give interviews and set up meetings, and then RCA kind of got involved, and then Dennis
Right.
Katz. So the and then tours. We had to get a band, so they got like a high school band. That's all they could afford on
Is that
tour.
the
Yeah,
Lou Reed and the Tots?
yeah,
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 they were basically a high school band. They were young
yeah,
guys. Hmm.
yeah,
Hmm.
so,
There's a release, just in case anybody's interested,
yeah.
called American Poet Live. Have you ever heard this? You probably have, right?
I'm not sure
Okay.
what you're talking about, but
It's actually Lou Reed and the Tots live in Hempstead, Long Island. I think there was like a Hempstead Arena or somewhere like that had, he played at. And it's a very good quality recording. I think it might have been on the radio
hmm
originally.
hmm
And it's like a 2 CD set that I got. A friend of mine got it for me for Christmas like a few years back, and it's excellent. It's excellent quality. And the interesting thing at that point with the Tots is these guys, they seem like they could play. I don't know. What did Lou think of them?
Well, I was with Lou,
Hmm.
Dennis Katz, his brother Steve Katz
Hmm.
from Blood, Sweat, and Tears. uh, got together this band. He knew them, and there was a rehearsal studio in Dobbs Ferry. So we went out to Dobbs Ferry. It was about 3 or 4 weekends, uh, and he just rehearsed. He basically taught them all of the music that he had that eventually ended up on the Lou Reed first album.
Right, right. Now that album was put out in early '72 by RCA and
hmm
produced by Richard Robinson.
hmm
What do you remember about the making of this album? I mean, it was his first solo effort. What was happening?
So I knew Richard and Lisa well. Lisa used to have these soirees where then they would all come over to Lisa's house, and Richard
Lisa
would play.
Robinson.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and Richard would play the music, and Lou would sit around on the floor, and there'd be a circle around him, and he'd just talk, and everybody would just be, open mouth, gaping,
Mhm.
and listening to everything that he had to say. But it was a networking possibility. That's what was going on. At any rate, Richard finally did get the job, and they decided to go out to London. I was Trident Studios in London, and I was at the Playhouse when I wasn't in school from 9 to 5. I was rehearsing or auditioning. So he wanted me to go. He was begging me to go because he depended upon me in terms of support, emotional support. It was that very dependent, and no, I can't do it. I can't get out. I couldn't leave for that
Yeah.
long. So he went to London with Richard. They recorded it, and I liked the album very much, and Lou was very proud of that album. It was a unfettered, very straightforward interpretation of a couple of new songs, as well as some from the Velvet Underground period.
Right. Now he reworked a few Velvet Underground songs.
hmm
Yeah, I as a fan, I love this album. Okay.
hmm
And I think that it kind of gets a little overlooked because the next album that comes out is Trent. Okay, and
Right.
that eclipsed pretty much everything he did at that point. Um, Transformer, they
That
start. Go ahead. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
No, I was there. So when Transform was recorded, we went back to London, and I came along with him. Then that was a
Right.
great period in his life. That was a wonderful time.
Well, you know, David Bowie is the producer. Everybody knows that.
Yeah,
And Mick
yeah.
Ronson of Bowie's band, the great guitarist, was involved. He did a lot of the arrangement,
Arranging. Yeah.
string arranging, and all that stuff. Um,
Sweet guy, really talented,
yeah,
amazing.
yeah,
Yeah,
big loss that he.
yeah.
Uh, Now what did what was the consensus about bringing Bowie on board? Like, Bowie had just really was coming out. Ziggy Stardust was out, I think, at that point, or about to come out, and he was kind of a rising star, I should say. Um, did you think that Bowie was going to be good for his career, Betty?
Well, I think everybody did, and I know that he was very excited. He basically said to me, if we could work on the same label, because RCA was somewhat courting him, and they were also courting David. So and so he flew into New York, and we had a couple of meetings. We got together, him and Angie, and basically they wanted to work together. And I think that's pretty much what happened. And so Lou was signed, and Bo got signed on as the producer and that's how it was recorded.
Yeah, yeah.
Wow.
When this album was completed, obviously there was going to be a tour after that,
Yeah.
and you make a great point in your book about how kind of in those days women were pretty much you know seen but not heard, I should say. Okay. Kind of like just in the background, not expected to do that much, but you wanted to be involved with his tour, right?
I went on the first tour with Lou
Mhm.
and the Tots, and I was just babysitting, and I'm
Yeah.
not interested in that at all. And it's a very tough life, and it was a lot of shows on the tours. I didn't want to go back, and he said, "I can't do it without you. You have to." And he was that kind of a personality. He did become very dependent upon the woman that he was involved with. It happened with with Sylvia, and I think that's probably one of the reasons why Laurie, kept her own apartment, and
Hmm.
and she realized, that you're going to get sucked into lose, and you know, so it kept her distance because he would glom onto you, and he really you'd suck everything out of your life. So I said,
You're
I don't
kind of
want to go.
sucked into the Lou Reed
I,
orbit,
I, I
right?
don't I don't I don't want to go, and
Yeah.
unless I have a job. And I'd finished with the training at the Playhouse. So he said, "But you're free now." And I said, "But I'm not going if I don't have a job." And he said, "Well, what do you want to do? Tell me what you want to do." I said, "Well, the only thing that I think I would be interested is lights, because I'm a theater person, and lighting is really challenging and very important, and I could learn from that." And he said,
Right.
"So do you want to direct my lights and design them?" And I said, "How can I don't know anything about lights, He said, "Well, I have a lighting company. I'll have them teach you." Really? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, all
Yeah.
right, maybe. And that's what happened. And so they did. They were very generous and taught me the basic rudiments of, how to, creating a lighting plot. And so the next tour I was on, I was up in I was there in the lighting booth, calling the lights, operating the lighting board, and then calling the lights for the spot operators. And
Right.
it worked because I knew all of his songs. I knew the lyrics to all of his music, so I could design
Right. And
his shows.
lighting is so important. Just for everybody listening, when you're doing a tour, a show, has to certain songs require certain kinds of lighting. And Lou at that time was wearing he was wearing a lot of makeup, right? He was wearing
The whiteface
white
was,
face.
and you could probably credit that to the glam rock, and that
Yeah.
would be Bowie, and yeah, and so
Mhm.
yeah,
So
so
you
he
knew how
was
to
he yeah.
light him in a way that would accentuate the way he looked and all that, right?
Well, because I knew his songs, I knew his lyrics. I have a basic English background, but I also have a theater background, so I kind of it worked. And he was very cooperative with me, and it was actually a really nice part of our relationship. It wasn't until I wrote the book that I realized, oh my God, no women were doing this. I then remembered that it was just me and a bunch of big old, union guys. You go from one house to the next, these big old, union guys. They look at you like, "Oh, who are you again? And what do you
What do
want
you?
me to do?"
Yeah.
But
Wow.
It worked out. It was all right. And it
Well,
was a really
better than
interesting
right?
experience. Yeah.
It's better than babysitting, I guess.
Yeah, much.
Yeah. Now, at this point, Transformer was a big hit, and there's a song on Transformer called "Perfect Day." It's one of the definite standout songs on the album. It's a ballad, and it's written about a picnic in the park, Central Park, and you would know something about that because it's really written about you, right?
Yeah, that was the day that we it was a day that we spent uh at Central Park. I'm sorry, the phone keeps ringing. I don't know what the heck. Anyway, so and he wanted to meet because he was feeling very successful, and we'd been working on the road constantly. We come home maybe one weekend every 3 or 4 weeks, and then we're back on the road again. It was really quite an extensive tour. So this was pretty much like a little bit of a break. Let's meet in the park, and and so we did, and champagne and at that wonderful restaurant in the park, and then he brought up the whole marrying thing again, and I was not at all interested in getting married.
Yeah, I mean, the book, and I'm sure in your screenplay that you've got, you go into this in a lot more detail. But there's points in the book where you mention how you're hesitant. Okay, you weren't really into getting married. But then there's a point, I guess, around the end of '72 or so, where you agreed to this. And I'm just wondering what was the change of heart? What made you realize you wanted to take that plunge?
Well, he had started, you know, when you're on tour, there's a lot of cocaine. and and actually cocaine is almost medicinal,
Yeah,
because it keeps you awake. And the way the tour was booked, it was so extensive that you just went from the hotel to sound check and then the show, and then you came back, and then you got on the plane the next day and went to another, and it was constant like that, so it was almost medicinal. But you take enough of a medicinal dose of cocaine, and he needed it, and the combination of alcohol and cocaine, and the fact that he couldn't write. He got into a situation where he had writer's block after Transformer came out. He was like 9 months, and RCA was waiting for his next album, and he couldn't freaking produce it.
yeah.
So he was freaking out, which meant that he was taking more drugs and he
And
was drinking more,
drinking.
and we would go to Max's Kansas City. It was insane, but it was interesting scene certainly. But and of course, this is a comparison between the rock and roll life and couldn't you just please be a quiet poet? But it didn't work out that way. So
Right,
anyway,
right. Now,
so the
you know,
drinking and and you asked about.
mhm,
I come from a family, they're Norwegian, and they don't get married till they're like 30. My grandmother was 30 when she got married. Norwegians wait till the very last minute, go out and just have all your wild time, and then settle down for the rest of your life. And that's how I was brought up. So I was 23 or 22. No. But at this point, it looked like the only way maybe that I could uh, put some kind of stopper on this, to have some control over the kind of behavior that was happening, and maybe make him feel a little bit more supported, and he wanted this to happen. So I finally consented, and that's pretty much what happened uh, uh, at that day in the park. We had lunch, and then we had a fight, which is not in the song, and then we
no,
met up
that's not.
again, and we saw some. We went and saw some animals in the park, and went and saw a French movie afterwards, and we
Did you drink
talked about
sangria?
when I would when we would get engaged and get married, and it happened soon after that.
Is the sangria part true?
Yeah, it
Okay,
is. Did I
very good.
say champagne? I meant sangria.
Yeah,
Sorry. You're
yeah.
right. Absolutely. Exactly what happened is what happened in the song. That's what happened.
Wow. Now, you mentioned about Lou's writer's block, and
Yeah.
that would be, it's typical for people to have trouble to write an album after a very big hit album. There's a lot of pressure. But you were
There's more
kind of,
involved in that. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, and you were kind of surprised, I believe, I would say, when you finally heard what he was going to make as the theme and the topics of this new album, which would be called Berlin. It was a concept album, and produced by Bob Ezrin. And Lou used to pretty much sing things to you acoustically, like play acoustic guitar and sing to you the songs.
All the time. Yeah. When he
Yeah,
wrote songs. Yeah.
yeah. So
And
tell us about.
sometimes I would sing them too.
Oh, okay, okay. What happened when you first heard some of these tracks that would be on Berlin?
Well, I got up and it was like early in the morning, and we were living together in our apartment on the Upper East Side, and he wasn't in the bed next to me. So I got up and he was out there in the living room, and it was about 9 o'clock in the morning, and 3/4 of a bottle of scotch is gone. It's propped up, on his knee. He's dead out sleeping in his, writing chair, and he's holding the bottle. And it was way too early for this, so I woke him up, and he was just so happy because he said, "I wrote the album." What? I wrote the album. It's done. I have it. I have it. I want to play it. I need to play
Overnight,
it for you. Yeah, he did
overnight.
actually.
Wow.
Well, there's, pretty much there's some songs that he had been working on fragments of. There's a couple of songs that he had been working on earlier, but he put together and made them fit into it. But yeah, he basically wrote it overnight. And
Yeah.
that's how Lou wrote on
Right.
top of it all. That's pretty much, that was his. And then he didn't really change it all that much.
Right. Right. Did you
So he
want
wanted to play it for me.
right? And what were you? Some of the topics.
I had no idea what this
Right.
album was about. All,
Right.
all we were living with was the constant pressure that he couldn't, produce anything. It was basically because I think he became famous over music that really didn't represent him at all. And that's what Walk on the Wild Side suddenly made him a star. And Walk on the Wild Side is not anywhere near the kind of music that Lou, typically wrote or, played. It was really a Bowie. That was a Bowie thing.
And he kind of struggled with that, right? He felt it wasn't.
It wasn't representing him.
Right. Right.
And yet that's what gave him his fame. And I believe that a great deal of the root of the writing problem was that, like, what do I write? What do I write now? But he finally did get this story, and I didn't know anything about what this album was until he said, I want to play it for you, which is what he always did.
Right.
And he sat me down and he started to play it
And what
after I got some coffee. Yeah.
and what did you think when you heard it? Because it touched on some very personal things, right?
Well, I do go into that in the book as well, and there's a terrific scene in the movie about this. I've had a couple of people read it, and they're professionals, and it basically is. But it I had a particularly my childhood. My father and mother met after World War II. My dad was in World War II. Invasion in Normandy, and then that really bloody war that happened afterwards. He was shot, and
Wow.
he was hospitalized, and got several Bronze Stars, and he was in a hospital in Fort Benning when he met my mother, who just happened to be there, and went with her uncle, and they were
Wow.
introduced at a dance. Dad had a musical background. He could play any instrument by ear, just by picking it up. It was ridiculous. And my mother was into music, and so they fell in love and had a great marriage. But Dad had PTSD. He would lose it because he had electric shock treatments, which is what they
Wow.
gave World War II soldiers. That's when they began. And of course, one of the things that tied Lou and me really together was that he had had electric shock
Yes.
treatments, and I had grown up with a man who had, so I knew what electric shock treatments do to people. And I believe that's really what got him to really trust in me, because we did share that background.
Sure.
So I had finally told Lou a little bit about the what had happened. I was kidnapped. My father kidnapped me from my mother. My mother left my father. And I was very young, and because of his treatment of her, he adored and loved her. But sometimes with these electric shock treatments, it shatters their nerves. They can't take anything. Lou drank.
Right.
There was no alcohol in my family, but that was one of the reasons why Lou was drinking. It just calmed him down a little bit.
Well, it affects your short-term memory.
It affects a great deal of memory, yeah. But at any rate, and my father, my grandmother had you go down and get my daughter, because my mother had taken me back down to the South where she was from. So Dad came down, kidnapped me from my mother, brought me back up. I told that story to Lou finally. It was a very painful story because I adored my mother and I missed her very much. And I told him that story because she lost me she came up and fought for me and lost me.
Yeah.
And my parents, my grandfather and that family were relatively wealthy and could afford a good lawyer. She couldn't afford anything. High school kid from, New Orleans. She was from Louisiana,
Oh,
and she had no money. So she lost custody of me. And
yeah.
there was a lot of stories that they told about her that weren't true. And she was accused of being sleeping around and stuff and taking drugs and drinking, none of which she was doing. But that's what she was accused of in order to lose me, and she did. So I lost my mother, and she was accused of all these things. And this Berlin is about a woman who is, I think she's a torch song singer, torch song
Right.
artist, sings in bars and drinks and sleeps around with everybody, is a whore, and she has a child and she loses her daughter.
Yeah. There's the lyric, they're taking her children away because they say she's not a good mother. I believe that's,
And
yeah.
when I heard that, it was, oh my God, this is my story. And he's putting it on an album for the entire world to hear, that my mother was called a whore and all this stuff and lost me, and none of it was true. And now it's on an album in the entire. How could he do that? How could he use this incredibly
Hmm.
painful incident in my childhood? And he played it for me, and I said, how could you do this? And he said, I have to write a song. If I don't get a song out, an album out in 3 weeks, I'm losing the contract, baby. I got a story. And it's just a story.
Yeah.
No one will know it's you. No one will know that it's about your mother. If you just keep your mouth shut, nobody will know. And I said, yeah, but I will know. I know.
Did you feel betrayed?
Uh-huh. I did.
And was that
And I
pretty much,
think that's when he lost me.
yeah, I was going to say, was that when you pretty much, you know, ended it more or less?
Emotionally, but I
Yeah.
stuck around. I stayed because Dennis said, well, he's not going to be able to do this without you. And he couldn't. And now he had material for the album. So, and they were setting up the recording date. So I said, okay, well, I'll stay through the recording of Berlin. And that is pretty much what I did. I went to the studio a couple of times in London once again, but Lou spent a lot of time with Bob Ezrin, and there was a whole lot more than just drinking going on.
Yeah.
It was a beautiful studio album, but I was pretty much at home, hanging around a studio isn't all that much fun if you're not working anyway. And I think I wasn't interested in being there. because I didn't want to hear these songs over and over and over again. It was incredibly painful. So I would go and museums and shopping and seeing things in London and meeting friends for lunch and stuff. Angie, and then I'd be home when he came carried in the door at 4 o'clock in the morning, and I would just hold him, and then he'd be okay to go out and the next day and go back to recording, and that's how it went.
Right. Now, with the Berlin album completed, he had to go back out on tour again.
Yeah.
And it for him, right? I mean, it didn't go exactly as well as planned. The critics kind of were a little down on it.
They hated it. They
Yeah.
hated it. It
They just
almost
wanted more.
destroyed.
Yeah,
It almost destroyed his career.
Yeah. And he would stay away from these songs for many, many, many years.
30,
Okay.
35 years, yeah.
Yeah, and only really revisit them in the last few years of his life. And in that time, the album became, the opinion of it changed, and it became, people got it, I guess, finally, or whatever.
30 years later, yeah.
30 years later. I mean, the first time I ever heard it, I said, this is one of the darkest, most depressing things I've ever heard. And it is still dark and depressing in a sense, but it really has, in the public consciousness, it has become, a much more classic rock and roll rock record, 70s rock concept record. And
well, there is a couple that are falling apart. They're falling apart, and my marriage was falling apart because Louis was taking so much drugs and alcohol, and oh my God, and so not everything on the album, of course, was true. It was an enormous amount of exaggeration, but some of it was. And and so now not only my mother and what wasn't true, but there's my marriage for the entire world to hear some of it as it falls apart. So that was fun.
Wow. Can you tell us about the last time you saw him?
Well, I was on tour with him. I stayed for the European. I think it was Amsterdam and Germany, and London, and the last time was in Paris. And we were at the Hotel Bristol. It's a really beautiful, old, gorgeous, hotel. And it was just, there was just so many drugs.
And it wasn't just cocaine anymore, right?
Well, by now I had divorced him,
Right.
but he convinced me to come back to him because I had always said, if I ever see a needle around you, I am out of here. And I caught him one night at a party with a supposed friend of ours who was shooting him up. And that's when I asked for a divorce, and I flew to Santo Domingo, 24-hour divorce. But within 2 weeks, he came and said, no, I won't do it anymore. I'll stop it. So he got me back that way.
Right.
And so we were in London now, and then Paris, and he didn't stop. I didn't see the needles, but I'm not an idiot.
Yeah.
But there was a lot of snorting of cocaine going on, and he ran out of coke before the show for Paris. And so he said, if you hadn't had any, then there'd at least be some for me. And I've been awake for like 3 days and 3 nights. How do you think I stay awake?
Yeah.
On tour and with you and taking care of you. And he just said that, I don't know, he called me something pretty awful.
Yeah.
And then he shoved me.
Okay. So
This was the second time that he had been physical with me.
Mm-hmm.
The first time he gave me a black eye on a tour, and I gave him one back. But so now, and he said he never did it again. That was it. But now here we are, and he shoved me, and that's not going to happen. Nobody's going to do that to me. So there was a glass of milk on a table in front of us, and I just I picked it up and threw it at him
Wow.
in his face, and I said, "Here, have something healthy to drink, please."
Oh, God.
For
Wow.
once, and left.
And that was the very last time you saw him, right?
Yeah.
Wow. Wow.
I mean, he had his doctor call me about 2 months after I left him, and so his doctor called me, the one that was giving him the wonderful shots,
Mm-hmm.
and Lou needs you. He wants you back. He can't live without you. If Lou wants me, Lou's going to have to call me himself. So
Yeah.
it was pretty much the same thing with Lincoln.
Right. Well, Bettye, you wrote this book and it was published in 2016, and now you've got a screenplay that you've completed, right?
Yep.
And you're trying to shop this. So anybody listening, what's the best way to contact you regarding the screenplay or anything?
You can contact my publisher. He's in London, Jawbone Press.
Okay. Is there an email address or anything you want to give out?
Yeah, it's jawbonepress, .com.
.com.
It's an independent publisher in London. He's wonderful.
Okay. So Bettye, I'd like to really thank you for coming on. And this was a fantastic, amazing story. Very heartfelt. And I know it was difficult, I'm sure, for you to revisit all this, but it's a story that, you got down in a book. And now that you got a screenplay, let's hope and pray this could be made into something, because it really tells the story and puts a different light onto Lou Reed in a way that people may not realize he was even like that.
Well, the screenplay is pretty much, it's really basically now, it's a love story about a couple,
Mm-hmm.
and how it's a beautiful love story that starts to fall apart. And the only difference here is that the guy in the love story is Lou Reed.
It is a love story, absolutely.
It was, the book is, and so is the movie. So
Wow.
that's how the movie goes into a little bit more now of the relationship itself, and it's coming from the woman's point of view, pretty much.
Sure. I think it's fascinating, and I wish you all the best. I hope that it gets picked up. And again, if people want to read the book, it's called Perfect Day, An Intimate Portrait of Life with Lou Reed by Bettye Kronstad. Thank you, Bettye, very much. And when this show is ready to come up, I'll be in touch with you, and you'll get all the links, and you can share it around just like we're going to do that, okay?
Thank you, Mike.
I hope so, too, and I'll be in touch with you, all right?
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Rob. Thanks, Mike.
Anytime. Have a good one.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.